want to begin with a quiet truth that lives in the chest like a small bird, because someday your heart and mine will stop, and the world will keep moving while our chairs sit empty. You may have felt this truth in an ordinary morning, when sunlight fell on a coffee mug, and suddenly you imagined that one day the mug would outlast you. You may have felt it in a hospital corridor, where antiseptic air turns every step into a prayer you never learned, and someone you love lies sleeping, thin and brave. This is not a thought anyone wants to hold long, yet it returns like a tide that understands the shoreline better than we do, shaping our days whether we admit it or not. We often try to outrun it with noise and plans, adding appointments to a calendar that looks powerful, though its power ends at the last blank square. We scroll and shop and chase small applause, as if distraction could build a dam across a river that has flowed longer than our species can remember. But the river does not ask permission to be real, and our refusal to look at it only guarantees we stumble when we finally glance down. What if looking at the river could help us walk straighter, kinder, and with deeper attention to the banks that hold our lives together? Many traditions have tried to make the river less frightening by learning its language, and some of those lessons still speak softly to us today. Epicurus suggested that fear dissolves when we examine it, because where we are alive, death is absent, and where death is present, there is no one left to suffer. His view asks us to notice how much pain comes from imagination, since we carry a future terror into a present that only contains this breath and the next one. Buddhist practice goes further by inviting us to sit beside the river, watching each sensation and thought pass, learning that what we call a self is a raft of changing parts. Here, fear loosens not because death disappears, but because identity stops pretending it is granite rather than water, moving, blending, and returning to the sea. In Mexico, families build altars for Dia de los Muertos, welcoming the dead with marigolds, bread, and stories, turning absence into presence through memory and celebration. These celebrations say that love can cross the river without a passport, and that grief is allowed to dance, to laugh, and to eat sweet bread shaped like bones. Other traditions keep death at the center like a compass needle, insisting that meaning becomes visible only because the end exists, like a horizon drawing the lines of a landscape. Heidegger wrote of being toward death, not as a gloomy fixation, but as the most personal appointment that clarifies every other choice, sharpening the contours of freedom. Medieval Christians kept skulls on desks and painted vanitas still lifes, not to glamorize darkness, but to remind busy minds that no jewel survives the candle's final smoke. Samurai texts taught warriors to rehearse their death each morning, not to embrace violence, but to move through duty without hesitation, anchored by acceptance rather than denial. African ancestor traditions weave the living and the dead into one community, so life feels less like an isolated sprint and more like a relay where memory carries the baton. Even the oldest epic we know, the story of Gilgamesh, turns on a king who fails to outrun death, yet learns that built walls and faithful friendships can still matter deeply. Modern psychology adds new texture by studying what happens when people are reminded of mortality, exploring how that awareness can both narrow and widen our behavior. Some experiments find that when death is made salient, we cling more tightly to our groups, our flags, and our opinions, as if belonging could build a safer house. Yet other research shows that mortality reminders can nudge generosity, creativity, and gratitude, especially when people feel connected to values larger than their own survival. The difference often lies in whether fear grabs the wheel or meaning does, because the same roadside sign can send one driver into rage and another into resolve. If we do not face death consciously, it can steer us from the back seat, whispering urgency that turns into pettiness, or insecurity that dresses up as pride. If we face it with courage and curiosity, it can become a stern teacher with kind eyes, handing us a syllabus titled Priorities, Relationships, and Courage. First, death as a teacher of priorities asks a simple but powerful question: which work would still justify your hour if today was the last day you had? Time management advice often centers on efficiency, but mortality teaches sufficiency, reminding us that the goal is not to do everything, but to do the right things. Consider a story from hospice care, where nurses hear familiar regrets not about failing to buy more, but about failing to live honestly, lovingly, and with permission to be oneself. People speak of missed conversations, postponed adventures that never fit a calendar, and the habit of saying yes to please others while saying no to the quiet call within. Mortality is a highlighter pen passed across the page, drawing fluorescent lines through a few sentences, and letting the rest fade into the ordinary background of ink. It asks you to name the work that would still feel worthy under a short horizon, and to move the first small piece of that work into today. It asks you to audit your habits by asking whether they steer you toward the person you promised to become, or whether they keep you on the same safe loop. It invites you to stop confusing activity with aliveness, since a day can be packed with movement and still be empty of meaning when the lights go off. Second, death as a test of relationships asks, who would you call if the clock whispered, and who would cross a city at midnight to sit beside your bed? The end shrinks the theater of life to the front rows, and the names in those seats tell a truer story than any follower count or public applause. When we remember we will die, petty arguments feel like heavy coats on a warm day, and putting them down becomes easier because carrying them makes less sense. Forgiveness does not become effortless, yet it becomes practical, because you realize that pride will not hold your hand in the last hour, but a reconciled friend might. Mortality encourages specific sentences that matter, like I am sorry, I forgive you, I am grateful, and I love you, because unsent messages become a different kind of ghost. It invites routines of attention that thread love into ordinary fabric, like weekly calls, birthday letters, and meals where phones sleep in another room so eyes can meet. It reframes conflict as a chance to practice presence, since the energy used to win can be redirected into the courage to listen without rehearsing your counterattack. It suggests building rituals that carry memory forward, like photo albums with stories recorded in your voice, or a recipe written in your own hand for someone after you. It asks you to notice who brightens your hours rather than drains them, and to invest where warmth multiplies, because warmth becomes a legacy that outlives cleverness. Third, death as a measure of courage invites us to step toward what matters, even while knees shake, because bravery is not the absence of fear but its companion on the road. Some people hear the clock and start running marathons across continents, while others finally write the song that has lived unpublished in their apartment for a decade. Courage may look like changing careers when the safe one drains your soul, or like staying in a difficult love and learning new ways to be gentle. It may look like making a will and an advance directive, not because you enjoy paperwork, but because care is also a form of love that plans ahead. It may look like telling your child the truth about illness with tenderness, because clarity wrapped in kindness can be lighter to carry than silence wrapped in worry. Courage grows when we practice small exposures to the truth, like walking through a cemetery and reading names, imagining each name as a library of stories and songs. Courage grows when we imagine the worst and prepare for it briefly, then return to the day with lighter shoulders because contingency is not the same as catastrophe. Courage grows when we admit that grief will visit us like weather, and we build inner rooms where the rain can fall without flooding the entire house. With those 3 lessons in mind, we can practice practical reflections that translate mortality into movement, so the idea becomes a lived rhythm rather than a dramatic monologue. Start with conversations about death while life is ordinary, because calm kitchens are better classrooms than emergency rooms where tears make every word heavy. You might ask parents how they want to be remembered, or what music they would choose for a farewell, and you might write their answers in a notebook that becomes a gift. You might talk with friends about the values you want to protect in hard times, and about the stories you want told when those friends raise a glass after you are gone. These conversations can be awkward at first, but awkwardness is simply honesty stretching new muscles, and those muscles soon carry the weight of love more capably. Write letters to your future self dated 5 years ahead, telling that person what mattered to you now, and asking them to send gratitude backward the day it is read. Write letters to your future children or your future friends, even if you never meet them, because writing clarifies the shape of your care and plants seeds in soil you cannot see. Write a legacy letter to someone who changed you, while both of you are alive, since gratitude delivered late is still sweet, but gratitude delivered early becomes a living bridge. Plan small daily acts of care that gain importance when seen from the riverbank, like making tea for someone, mending a shirt, or answering a message with your full attention. Plan weekly blocks where you do the work that would still matter under a short horizon, and protect those hours as if they were medicine your life depends on. Plan monthly rituals that gather your people, such as Sunday soup nights or walks at dawn, because rhythm weaves memory where random meetings rarely do. These practices are not about pretending death is lovely or easy, because sorrow deserves its full weight, and shallow optimism insults the depth of loss. This is where we acknowledge the counterpoint to toxic positivity, which tries to paste a smile over a fracture and calls any tear a failure of mindset. Grief is not a problem to be solved but a landscape to be crossed, and the crossings reshape us in ways that make new kindness possible. There is also a counterpoint to nihilism, which claims that if we die, nothing matters, turning the river into a reason to stop building and stop singing. But the absence of forever does not erase the presence of now, just as a song with an ending can still change a night and a life. Meaning grows from encounters, commitments, creations, and care, and the fact that they end does not empty them. It frames them in a way that makes them legible. If you insist that only permanent things matter, you will wait forever for permission to love, and forever will never arrive while you still have breath. If you insist that nothing matters, you will abandon the very practices that could have proved you wrong, like friendship, craft, courage, and cooking dinner on Mondays. So we hold the middle path where honesty and hope shake hands, where grief and gratitude share a table, and where mortality becomes the instructor rather than the invader. Think of a case study that began a global movement of gentler endings, when a nurse named Cicely Saunders listened to the pain of patients and built the modern hospice model. She understood that people do not need only morphine and monitors. They also need stories, touch, music, and relief from loneliness, all the human ingredients of a good goodbye. Her work reminds us that care is built from countless small choices made by ordinary people, and that those choices can ease the hardest roads we walk. Another example arrives from art and photography, where shadows make images believable, because without darkness, a picture looks flat, bright, and strangely false. Mortality is the shadow that gives the portrait of life its depth, guiding the eye to faces and hands, and the soft edges where light turns into warmth. This metaphor helps us synthesize the lessons into a single shape we can carry, because it tells us to pay attention to contours rather than hiding the contrast. When the shadow is denied, everything looks overexposed and painfully thin, like a smile that never reaches the eyes or a day that never admits the night. When the shadow is all we see, the image collapses into gloom, and we forget the play of highlights on skin and the crisp line where two colors meet. Balance arrives when we let the shadow be present but not in charge, informing composition without stealing the subject, deepening beauty without dictating despair. So ask the first question of priorities. Where does the shadow tell you your time is misaligned, and what 2 small steps could bring light to the right place? Ask the second question of relationships. Who is standing partly in the dark and could be warmed by a call, a letter, a visit, or a long walk together? Ask the third question of courage. What work or truth waits just beyond your fear, and what first honest sentence will move that truth into this week? You might decide to say no to activities that feed only the calendar, and say yes to work that feeds the person who will sign the calendar. You might decide to repair the bridge that is still repairable, and to bless the bridge that must remain uncrossed without turning its absence into a lifelong wound. You might decide to learn a simple courage, like scheduling the medical appointment you have delayed, or sharing your poem with 12 friends instead of keeping it in a drawer. Remember that nothing large is built without small bricks, and nothing honest stays honest without maintenance, which means returning, revising, and forgiving yourself when you forget. Remember that presence is a gift you can give without money, and that presence, more than presence, turns a holiday or an ordinary Tuesday into a memory with weight. Remember that when you carry the shadow gently, you notice more colors in the light, because contrast educates attention, and attention is the true fuel of love. If these reflections feel heavy, that is because they are made from serious clay. But clay is exactly what we use to shape bowls that hold nourishment. You do not have to become a philosopher to eat from such a bowl. You only need to ask the right questions and keep asking them as seasons turn. Am I living in a way I would defend kindly at the end? And if not, what small kindness toward myself would help me change the direction? Am I speaking to the people who matter as if time were precious, because it is? And is there an apology or a thanks that should go out today? Am I practicing one courage that makes me slightly more alive this month? And can I reward that courage with rest, rather than punishment disguised as productivity? One day you and I will join the long list of names on stones and screens, and someone will say our names over a table or on a porch. Between now and then, we have an appointment with priorities, relationships, and courage, and the minutes that show up to that appointment will accumulate into a life. Between now and then, we can learn to talk about death without letting it steal the music, and to sing over it with voices that have learned how to crack and heal. Between now and then, we can build habits that make our love durable, our work meaningful, and our evenings more like gatherings than like scrolling toward sleep. The shadow will accompany us whether we look at it or not, so we might as well let it teach us to see the edges of what matters. The shadow will change our definition of success, trading endless ladder climbing for crafted days where purpose and rest are allowed to meet with dignity. The shadow will remind us that silence is not the enemy of life, since silence is where attention grows, and attention is where love recognizes the beloved. The shadow will also remind us to play, since play is the lightest courage, and laughter is one of the few sounds that can cross the river without losing its echo. So here is our compact for the week ahead. Look at the river each morning, call one person you love, and take one step toward the work that would still matter at the end. And here is our compact for the month ahead. Write a letter to your future self, plan a conversation about what to do when life becomes fragile, and mark a day for rest. The point is not to master death like a test, but to let death master us just enough to reveal the proportions of a good life. The point is not to stop fearing, but to fear more intelligently, so fear becomes a lantern instead of a wall, and courage becomes a habit instead of a performance. When you feel the ache of this topic return, breathe, and name 3 things you can care for today, because care turns fear into movement and grief into meaning. When you forget or fall into old patterns, do not punish the forgetting, just return. Because returning is how rivers find the sea and how people find their path. When you doubt that small acts matter, imagine a day at the end and ask whether you would trade a single hour of presence for any loud achievement you pursued. You already know the answer, because the heart is wiser than our slogans, and it counts meaning with a gentler arithmetic than numbers ever learn. So let the shadow stand behind you like a quiet friend, deepening the scene and keeping the light honest, while you do what you came here to do. Let it keep your priorities aligned, your relationships tended, and your courage awake, not through drama, but through rhythm that turns care into a way of being. Let it remind you that love is measured by attention, that attention is measured by time, and that time is not infinite, which makes attention a precious gift. And when the day ends, thank the shadow for its lesson. Then put down the lesson and sleep, because rest is part of courage, and tomorrow wants you well. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment, because your support helps these conversations reach the people who need them now. Like a shadow that gives the picture its depth, mortality shapes meaning not to darken our days, but to outline where the light is brightest and where our lives belong.